epiophorin and paraophorin. 5. Connective tissue. 6. Unstriped muscular fibers. And 7. Blood vessels and nerves. The portion of the broad ligament which stretches from the uterine tube to the level of the ovary is known by the name of the mesosalpinx. Between the fimbriated extremity of the tube and the lower attachment of the broad ligament is a concave rounded margin called the infundibulopelvic ligament. The round ligaments, ligamentum teres uteri, are two flattened bands between 10 and 12 cm in length, situated between the layers of the broad ligament in front of and below the uterine tubes. Commencing on either side at the lateral angle of the uterus, this ligament is directed forward, upward, and lateralward over the external iliac vessels. It then passes through the abdominal inguinal ring and along the inguinal canal to the labium majus, in which it becomes lost. The round ligaments consist principally of muscular tissue, prolonged from the uterus, also of some fibrous and areolar tissue, besides blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves, enclosed in a duplicature of peritoneum, which, in the fetus, is prolonged in the form of a tubular process for a short distance into the inguinal canal. This process is called the canal of Nuck. It is generally obliterated in the adult, but sometimes remains pervious even in advanced life. It is analogous to the saccus vaginalis which precedes the descent of the testis. In addition to the ligaments just described, there is a band named the ligamentum transversalis cali, Mackenroth, on each side of the cervix uteri. It is attached to the side of the cervix uteri and to the vault and lateral fornix of the vagina, and is continuous externally with the fibrous tissue which surrounds the pelvic blood vessels. The form, size, and situation of the uterus vary at different periods of life and under different circumstances. In the fetus the uterus is contained in the abdominal cavity, projecting beyond the superior aperture of the pelvis. The cervix is considerably larger than the body. At puberty the uterus is piriform in shape, and weighs from 14 to 17 grams. It has descended into the pelvis, the fundus being just below the level of the superior aperture of this cavity. The palmate folds are distinct, and extend to the upper part of the cavity of the organ. The position of the uterus in the adult is liable to considerable variation, depending chiefly on the condition of the bladder and rectum. When the bladder is empty, the entire uterus is directed forward, and is at the same time bent on itself at the junction of the body and cervix, so that the body lies upon the bladder. As the latter fills, the uterus gradually becomes more and more erect, until with a fully distended bladder the fundus may be directed backward toward the sacrum. During menstruation the organ is enlarged, more vascular, and its surfaces rounder. The external orifice is rounded, its labia swollen, and the lining membrane of the body thickened, softer, and of a darker color. According to Sir J. Williams, at each recurrence of menstruation a molecular disintegration of the mucous membrane takes place, which leads to its complete removal, only the bases of the glands embedded in the muscle being left. At the cessation of menstruation a fresh mucous membrane is formed by a proliferation of the remaining structures. During pregnancy the uterus becomes enormously enlarged, and in the 8th month reaches the epigastric region. The increase in size is partly due to growth of pre-existing muscle, and partly to development of new fibers. After parturition the uterus nearly regains its usual size, weighing about 42 grams. But its cavity is larger than in the virgin state, its vessels are tortuous, and its muscular layers are more defined. The external orifice is more marked, and its edges present one or more fissures. In old age the uterus becomes atrophied and paler and denser in texture. A more distinct constriction separates the body and cervix. The internal orifice is frequently, and the external orifice occasionally, obliterated, while the lips almost entirely disappear. Structure. The uterus is composed of 3 coats, an external or serous, a middle or muscular, and an internal or mucus. The serous coat, tunica serosa, is derived from the peritoneum. It invests the fundus and the whole of the intestinal surface of the uterus, but covers the vesical surface only as far as the junction of the body and cervix. In the lower fourth of the intestinal surface, the peritoneum, though covering the uterus, is not closely connected with it, being separated from it by a layer of loose cellular tissue and some large veins. The muscular coat, tunica muscularis, forms the chief bulk of the substance of the uterus. In the virgin it is dense, firm, of a grayish color, and cuts almost like cartilage. It is thick opposite the middle of the body in fundus, and thin at the orifices of the uterine tubes. It consists of bundles of unstriped muscular fibers, disposed in layers, intermixed with areolar tissue, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. The layers are 3 in number: external, middle, and internal. The external and middle layers constitute the muscular coat proper, while the inner layer is a greatly hypertrophied muscularis mucosae. During pregnancy the muscular tissue becomes more prominently developed, the fibers being greatly enlarged. The external layer, placed beneath the peritoneum, is disposed as a thin plane on the vesical and intestinal surfaces. It consists of fibers which pass transversely across the fundus, and, converging at each lateral angle of the uterus, are continued on to the uterine tube, the round ligament, and the ligament of the ovary, some passing at each side into the broad ligament, and others running backward from the cervix into the sacro-uterine ligaments. The middle layer of fibers presents no regularity in its arrangement, being disposed longitudinally, obliquely, and transversely. It contains more blood vessels than either of the other 2 layers. The internal or deep layer consists of circular fibers arranged in the form of 2 hollow cones, the apices of which surround the orifices of the uterine tubes, their bases intermingling with one another on the middle of the body of the uterus. At the internal orifice these circular fibers form a distinct sphincter. The mucous membrane, tunica mucosa, is smooth, and closely adherent to the subjacent tissue. It is continuous through the fimbriated extremity of the uterine tubes with the peritoneum, and through the external uterine orifice with the lining of the vagina. In the body of the uterus the mucous membrane is smooth, soft, of a pale red color, lined by columnar ciliated epithelium, and presents, when viewed with a lens, the orifices of numerous tubular follicles arranged perpendicularly to the surface. The structure of the chorium differs from that of ordinary mucous membranes, and consists of an embryonic nucleated and highly cellular form of connective tissue in which run numerous large lymphatics. In it are the tube-like uterine glands, lined by ciliated columnar epithelium. They are of small size in the unimpregnated uterus, but shortly after impregnation become enlarged and elongated, presenting a contorted or waved appearance. In the cervix the mucous membrane is sharply differentiated from that of the uterine cavity. It is thrown into numerous oblique ridges, which diverge from an anterior and posterior longitudinal raphe. In the upper 2/3 of the canal the mucous membrane is provided with numerous deep glandular follicles, which secrete a clear viscid alkaline mucus, and in addition, extending through the whole length of the canal, is a variable number of little cysts, presumably follicles which have become occluded and distended with retained secretion. They are called the ovula nabothi. The mucous membrane covering the lower half of the cervical canal presents numerous papillae. The epithelium of the upper 2/3 is cylindrical and ciliated, but below this it loses its cilia, and gradually changes to stratified squamous epithelium close to the external orifice. On the vaginal surface of the cervix the epithelium is similar to that lining the vagina, that is, stratified squamous. Vessels and nerves. The arteries of the uterus are the uterine from the hypogastric, and the ovarian from the abdominal aorta. They are remarkable for their tortuous course in the substance of the organ and for their frequent anastomoses. The termination of the ovarian artery meets that of the uterine artery and forms an anastomotic trunk from which branches are given off to supply the uterus, their disposition being circular. The veins are of large size and correspond with the arteries. They end in the uterine plexuses. In the impregnated uterus the arteries carry the blood to, and the veins convey it away from, the intervillous space of the placenta. The lymphatics are described on page 714. The nerves are derived from the hypogastric and ovarian plexuses.